what generally I don't find that interesting is generalized, like how to improve your life kind of stories, right? Because there's
Right.
a lot of that stuff out there. But what came forward in your story was an authentic openness about your personal story, about about I forgot what the name was. Gotto, your grandmother.
Oh, Goggy.
Goggy, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
it's little things like that. I find it very. The moment I detect that people are open about stuff like that, opening up themselves, I know that when there's a conversation starting with them, um, it's not going to be surface level. I've done a couple of those episodes in the past, so if you go back way down the line, you will find those kind of episodes, and generally the end result is not that good, and that's also my mistake, right? That's mostly my mistake because as a host, you have the responsibility to guide and to frame and to make it interesting and to bring forward good questions. So it's not the guest's fault at all. But I found that it is a tough balance to strike.
Oh, for sure. I think I have such deep respect for good interviewers, right? Or the art of crafting a good interview. And I remember distinctly when I kind of realized that there was a true art to it. It was listening to Elvis Mitchell. And I don't know if you're familiar. So
No.
he I'm not going to do his bio justice, but he is how I came to know him is he had a radio program that I think was
Hmm.
distributed by NPR or PRI, one of those. And he would interview people within the cultural landscape. So whether it's artists or filmmakers or authors, and he didn't have a specific medium. And you could tell that he did so much research about the person and research in a way that I feel like, again, there's a nuance, right? Because there are some instances where you will watch a conversation between people and the person doing the interview, conducting the interview has maybe some preconceptions that they are bringing to the interview that may or may not be true about the person. And I felt like with Elvis Mitchell that his research really assisted in creating great questions and a real level of depth in terms of how he was approaching a guest. And he wasn't bringing in any kind of preconceptions or assumptions about the person.
Hmm.
So it was very much an open ended interview. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, yeah, there is a difference to how this gets done, right?
Yeah, and I think it also really depends on the personal style of the person. Y- People that are more naturally curious, I think, have an easier time of coming up with questions depending on what they hear from people in general, right? Not just in interviews, but in everyday conversations. But some people are more. It's not like they're less curious. It's more that they are trying to keep it more organized because that just works better for them. And then you can say something along the lines of, okay, it becomes less of an organic quote unquote conversation, but more like they have questions that they prepared and they go through those questions. And if there's like little golden nuggets in the answers that the guest is giving, or the person in general is giving, they can hook into that, right, and deepen that out a little bit, and both work fine. I think the last one is more like an analytical approach that you can do. A very good example. Well, I don't actually. I wanted to say a very good example is Lex Friedman, but I don't think that's true because Lex Friedman is actually very good in improvising in his actual conversation. So he has a balance between preparing questions for his guests,
Mm-hmm.
and then depending on what he hears, he improvises and in a very thoughtful way. But yeah, generally the same works for me. So
Yeah.
for our conversation today, there is a couple of questions that I prepared for you, and that's to make it interesting, but
Yeah.
also to have something to fall back on when there's like a stalemate for whatever reason. But at the same time, I found that the conversations where I'm not looking at those questions, but everything just comes, yeah, those are genius conversations. So the more questions that are prepared that go out the window at the end of the conversation, generally the better the conversation is. Yeah.
I love that. Well, I do think, I mean, that curiosity piece, right, is so vital. And I think of myself as kind of this almost relentlessly curious person. And I think about when I have met people in a social situation, and I feel like I can struggle with small talk in the sense of uh, the regular questions that everyone asks. I mean, I really resist asking someone what they do. That's such a, you go to a cocktail
Mm,
party or a gathering or
mhm,
whatever, something that's not work related specifically. And one of
mhm.
the first things is, oh, so what do you do? And I really don't like to ask that question because I feel like it's not that interesting, and probably a little bit of it originally stemmed from the time in my life when I had taken a break from work and I was raising my children, and I felt like that was I was in the I really undervalued the my role as a stay-at-home parent. And so when I was in those situations of, being in a group and people saying, "Oh, what do you do?" It just felt and I feel very sad about this, but it felt because it was an important job that I was doing, but in those kinds of conversations, staying that I stayed at home with my kids, uh, I felt like I would be so easily dismissed that it was easy to kind of discard me as probably not that interesting, maybe not that well read or connected, or it was it was like, oh, okay, I'll move on to the next person who does something interesting.
You're actually triggering me here. So I would like to instantly push back, and not against you, but against what you just laid out. Because that whole, okay, few thoughts here. Let me know what you think. That whole idea of the question, what do you do? Right? Or even the question, who are you? Then often what people do is they will bring forward their profession, right? So they will say forward, hey, in my case, it will be something along the lines of, hey, I'm a project manager working for this company. And I've been doing that so far, and this is my position, and this is the project that I'm working on.
Mhm.
But it's a very, like you said, it's a very, not just simplistic, but it's a very shallow way of defining who you are as a person, right? It's defining with, it's identifying yourself with labels, with your profession or with your age or with,
Well, it's
you know,
limiting,
where
right?
the
I
country
mean,
where you come from, whatever. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. It's very, very limiting. And the second point, and that's about what you just said, which I completely recognize, um, the idea that if you, it's like a fear that you're having, right? Because the moment that somebody asks you the question, what do you do, they want to know what you do for a living in the context of your profession. And it's like gauge, they ask that question, I think, well, one of the components why they ask that question is to gauge what your social status is. So
Hmm.
if you then give an answer like, hey, I'm a stay-at-home mother, then all of a sudden, for some reason, you are not worth that much. You're not interesting to
Yeah.
talk to because you don't have this CEO position within a big company or something like that. When you can arguably make the argument that motherhood is one of the toughest, if not the most toughest job in the world, and also one of the most important ones. Right? That's literally laying a foundation for the future, literally.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think maybe to wrap this up, two questions there. Why do you think people just identify with their jobs?
Yeah.
And second is why are we devaluing motherhood?
Well, I think for starters, I'll specifically around the question of motherhood or for also, dads out there and couples that are maybe less traditional than a heterosexual couple, right? Or a cisnormative couple, is that the parent, the stay-at-home parent, right? There is, especially I think in the United States, there can be this devaluing of that position because we are built on this idea of striving and achieving the American dream. And how are you doing that if you're, changing the diapers and, making lunches and making sure nap time is happening and things like that. And
Mhm.
and it was such a privilege for me to be able to do that. And both my children's dad and myself, we had parents who both had to be out in the workplace because of financial constraints. And we found it, we found it kind of lonely when we would come home as older kids and, being the latchkey kids and fending for yourself. And so we really had entered, that was an early conversation in our dating life, was kind of the importance of having someone at home and being able to do that. So it it was challenging at times. And boy, parenting is definitely not for the faint of heart, right? I think it is the toughest job for sure. And it's one of the best. I mean, I would never claim that I did it perfectly. I can think of so many different things that I wish I knew now. And of course, you can do that all day long, but it is such a valuable job, right? I mean, talk about going back to that idea of curiosity. I mean, as one of our great jobs as parents is to kind of foster that curiosity in these
Mhm.
little people. And I do think that it's so interesting too, because I have three children, when they were first born, and I had done a lot of babysitting. And so I had some familiarity with kids. It wasn't like it was completely a new thing. However, I wasn't prepared for how in love I was with them, right? I expected to love them, but I was just so in love with them. So the idea of going to some job, and not being with them it kind of, I couldn't even wrap my head around that. And then also how they being an only child, I didn't, grow up with siblings, and so also how when they're immediately born, they have this very distinct little personality. So I mean, I do think that in my best moments, I was a parent who was hopefully fostering curiosity within my children and the world around them, as well as themselves, and kind of shepherding these tiny individuals into adulthood. Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating thing that we are so quick to dismiss somebody who stays at home with their kids. And I do, and then going back to the earlier question around kind of this assignment, this this kind of the way that we are always looking to, I think a lot about connection. I think of connection as being such an important, just and it connection is what will save us as a species, right? And I'm not just talking about coexisting. I'm talking about connecting. And so one of the things that we do as humans is I do think that we have that inherited need for connection and belonging. And so we ask these questions. So the modern day questions that have evolved that we ask each other are, what do you do? Or what school did you go to? Or what, we're always trying to, in, I think at their core, they are these little lifelines that we're throwing out to try and find a connection with that other person. And yet there's been a distortion in kind of more of our modern life to be we're too judgmental around if the connection isn't obvious, that it's a person that, went to the same school that we did, or a similar school, or that they lived in a similar place, or they work in a field that we're interested in, that we're ready to move on to the next person.
Yeah, so let me dig a little bit with this idea of connecting with others, because I think you're right, and I think that's absolutely crucial for the survival of the entire species, for very practical reasons, but also for philosophical reasons. Um, let me bring forward a quote that you wrote online in a blog, I believe pretty recently. So what you wrote is, I don't want to become someone who is adverse to hearing about other viewpoints, sheltered from strangers and their interests, or surrounded by that which is familiar. I want spontaneous conversations. I continue to shop in the real world as much as possible, going to the grocery store, the pharmacy, etc. I am willing to engage with the person sitting next to me on a train or a bus. I am not denying that there are dangerous and horrible things happening every day in our world. However, for me, being safe and continuing to be open to others are not incongruent pursuits. So I think this ties into that connection. And I think what you're hinting there, that's how I'm interpreting it. What you're hinting at there is also a feeling of nostalgia and a feeling of wishing back to the times, when not everybody was having a smartphone, for example, and people had more time for each other. And that's certainly also something, if that interpretation is correct, that I see myself happening as well. So I live in a big city right now for Dutch standards. It will be probably like a big town in American standards, but that point aside, you don't go to your neighbor if you need a carton of milk or if you need a couple of eggs, right? You don't do that
Right.
anymore. And right now, I think we have reached a point that, at least in the city where I walk around in, that if you even say good morning to someone on the street, they will look at you pretty weird, and that will be, the least responsive version of that. Yeah, there can be pretty weird responses to simply a good morning, right? Which is also funny because if I go to a small town in Netherlands and I do the exact same thing, everybody is super relaxed, super super friendly when it comes to that. So there's also a small town versus big town dynamic playing here, I think. But back to what you wrote. Is it indeed for you a kind of nostalgia to the times where people spend more time with each other? And maybe a better question is even, why do you seek that connection with people? What is valuable about that for you personally, you think?
I know that the value, to me, it's very life affirming to be having spontaneous conversations, meaning conversations that happen outside of my normal day,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, being willing to kind of not be in such a rush as I'm checking out of the grocery store, and look at the person who's helping me with the checking out the food, and saying how are you doing, or how's your day going, even, right? And these are banal questions, and I feel like when you ask them and you're really looking at the person, right? I mean, I've entered into some great conversations with that person, and it's 2 minutes, 2 minutes, right? It's not a lifetime, and I don't know. We're not necessarily going to become best friends, but it is. I mean, what is nice is I maybe we'll go back to that same store and I can say, how was that? How was that graduation that you went to,
Mm-hmm.
or how was, right? And so I think just recognizing that everyone is just trying to live, right, in the best way possible that they can, given their circumstances. And I think that's one of the things that I love about travel. I mean, there is that, yes, it's wonderful to see a you know a different landscape, or to enjoy different foods. Or But I think that one of the things that I love most about travel is being reminded how similar we are in terms of our, the things that we envision for ourselves or for our families, right? I mean, they if we want to have a degree of safety and freedom to move about. We want to, and we want to have a place that we can call home. And, if we have children or family members, we want them to be, you know, at peace and healthy as well, right? So I think that there is, in that, those conversations with strangers, so to speak, there can be those life affirming moments just to recognize our sameness. So there's that piece that's very important. And I think a lot about the polarization of our societies, and our, again, our just our deep, I mean, I think at its core, again, is it's motivated by wanting to belong. So adopting an ideology or a belief system that allows us to group ourselves with
Yeah.
other people. And so that's why I have to, and I have struggled with this because I have strong feelings um, about, I guess, what I see as being right, right, and being okay. I have strong feelings about, having equality of opportunity within our neighborhoods or our world. And so when I feel like there's this polarity, that I feel like there's a closed downness, from people around, kind of entertaining other ways of being or thinking, it really, it can stir something in me. So I definitely haven't done it perfectly, but I really am working on being a better listener, and allowing myself to remind that part of me that wants to jump in and say, but don't you want to think about it this way instead of, what about this? And I've got to calm that part of myself so that I can stay in community with others and stay in engagement, and be reminded that we all are looking for this belonging and this sense of place. We're just kind of knowing what our place is in this world. And that's something I've struggled with, for a long time. I mean, going back to that, I'll take a breath in a second, but going back to that idea of asking, what do you do? There was a real stretch of time. I mean, probably, well, I'm 50. What am I now? I recently had a birthday, 57. So, I mean, up until probably even my mid 30s, I would think about myself and I was like, oh gosh, okay, so I'm a daughter, I'm a mother, I'm a granddaughter, I'm a volunteer. And I mean, even I was doing it to myself. I was assigning my value or my sense of self to these different roles that I was basically performing at the behest of the society I live within.
A couple of things came forward while you were talking for me, because I think there's the concept of being married to your ideas. So I think that people are very prone to taking the first thing that comes into their mind, that idea, then solidifying it in their mind and not letting it go anymore. And there comes a form of rigidity there, right? Because it means that you fall into the trap, I think, and I think it is a trap, that opposite viewpoints, or even viewpoints that slightly differ, they can't be seen anymore. And if they can be seen, they can be accepted, right? Because it actively attacks one's own mindset, one's own
Right.
ideas, which is technically speaking very silly, right? Because it means adopting potentially one of the weakest things to protect yourself with, right? Is going to the shop to buy yourself some armor that is made out of thin plastic in the hopes that it will stop bullets, right? It's very silly to go for that first thing and just solidifying it in your mind. So I I wonder I wonder why that phenomena exists. But I think at the same time, another thing that came forward while you were talking, because you said, there's also an underlying movement, or there's an underlying need to belong, right, to a group, and that makes a lot of sense for people maybe that are looking for meaning. It becomes very abstract now, but for that are looking for meaning, or a group that they can be a part of their own friends, because, for example, they have not built their own network yet in their life, something along those lines. Then aligning yourself with a certain thought process, ideology, let's say, that becomes very inviting, right? Because then all of a sudden, if you say and believe certain things, then all of a sudden you have a huge community that is standing
Mhm.
around you that you can be a part of, and that I can understand why that feels good, right? Especially if loneliness and not being heard play a factor. I can 100% understand why that can become a logical conclusion for that specific person. So what do you so what do you think about that? What do you think about that process of happening? What do you think is driving that? What do you think people should instead focus on?
There was a quote that I read, and it was recently Charlie Munger. And Charlie Munger has apparently a million quotes. There's entire books that have compiled his quotes. But I love this one that I read that said, "You have to be willing to kill your best idea." And he, of course, was speaking of
Right.
it in a much more kind of business setting, right? And when I first read it, that's kind of, I was, planning out a new workshop or something. So I was like, oh, okay. I was using it in that way too. However, I do think you can kind of take that same concept, right, and apply it within your personal life and your personal beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think what it is really leaning into is, for me, it brings forth this idea of having some humility, right? And being being willing, again, not to be right, and not to, so there's the humility of being willing to say, I don't know everything, or that I there's still more for me to learn, right? That curiosity piece that's always underlying so much of what I do. And I think the other thing that has evolved is in our, and I don't know if this is this kind of push in terms of things being kind of faster, and that there's information at our fingertips, and so there's very little kind of delayed gratification that is kind of in our everyday lives, is the idea that to change your mind, like giving yourself permission to change your mind. And I personally struggled with this for quite a while, because I was, I think, in part being a woman, also, as I mentioned, I felt like I went to I got my undergraduate degree. Um, I went to a liberal arts college, and I studied fine art and geography. So those, I think, felt like kind of squishy um, topics. And I think there was always this part of me that was like, oh gosh, I really need to be coming across more like professional, and more, more of a, someone who could be seen as corporate, and that just isn't
Hmm.
me. So, however, this idea of uh, changing my mind was kind of wrapped up in that identity of being somebody who was credible and trustworthy. and not flaky or not, inconsequential. But the reality is you make choices or decisions based on the information you have in the moment. And gosh, if you once new pieces of information come into your purview and you're not willing to, consider that maybe what you originally thought or the direction you were originally taking needs to be reevaluated, I don't know how smart that is. So give yourself permission to change your mind. I mean, you just acknowledge that, again, that humility of you knew only this much when you made that choice. Now you know this much. So is there a course correction that is necessary, right? I don't know.
Mhm.
Have you had kind of those distinct moments where you're like, oh gosh, I don't, where you've held on to an idea for too long because it felt like to change your mind would somehow make you look weak or
Yeah, I think I used to do that back in the day because I'm from a personality, so from a temperament, I'm pretty disagreeable. So I can be pretty set in my own thoughts and trying to push those forward. And I think when you're young and when you don't have a lot of experience, you fall victim to the idea of that you are right and that the rest is wrong, and that the idea that you have needs to be pushed forward. And that's certainly something that I fell for 100%. And for me, it was very much a journey to let go of that. And that took years, right? It took a lot of practice to understand the idea of you don't know anything, right? There's a whole lot of stuff out there you do not know, not even 1% of it. And there's all these different people with all these different experiences that have seen and learned and heard and spoken about all these different things that you have no idea about. And well, it happens on this podcast now all the time, right? With every single conversation that's here, there's different ideas coming forward that I'm trying to understand where they are coming from, right? And I might be 100% opposed to the idea. I might still have it. I might still have in my mind, like the conclusion that I'm hearing right now is flawed, doesn't make any sense. But that doesn't mean that the journey to that conclusion is flawed, right? There
Mhm.
might be a very legitimate reason why a specific line of thinking went to that conclusion. But if I don't look at that journey, right, I will never understand why the conclusion came forward. And then, yeah, you can throw the conclusion out the window and say something like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. But hold on a second, right? That journey can tell you a whole lot about a person. And this happened a couple of times, literally on this podcast, where I heard a conclusion about something and I was like, hold on a second. And we did a little bit of digging, and then I heard what the line of reasoning was that led to that conclusion, and it made sense. I
Hmm.
still think that the conclusion is flawed, but the reasoning makes sense, right? So that is, I think, connecting with a person. That is listening to a person.
Right.
And I think that the moment that you are able to connect with people as well, um, that it doesn't become like a conflict of two opposing views that will not let each other in, right?
Mhm.
Even if we are fully, if we even if we are, let's say we are completely opposite from each other. We are completely left versus right, black versus white. We are completely opposite from each other. By connecting, you know, even if just one person does it, the other person is way more likely also to let new information in because that person all of a sudden feels heard, right? If the
Mhm.
person feels constantly attacked, yeah, they won't let anything in because their defenses are very high up. So to answer your question, yes, I have definitely fallen into that trap, and it has definitely been um, quite a journey to realize you don't know anything, right? There's a whole lot you can learn from other people.
Several years ago when I actually still get a physical newspaper, but I had gotten the newspaper and there was this wonderful science writer who had this column, and it was this beautiful explanation of two truths being, two opposing, seemingly opposing truths being each being true at the same time, right? And it was talking
Mm.
about light and thinking about the physics, between light as a particle, and that it can be proved that light is a particle, and light as a wave, right? And that these are concepts that are seemingly in opposition to each other, and yet they are both true. And they both can be the journey, so to speak, to prove both of these things can be completely scientifically documented. And so that has always been a good reminder for me to just remember that I can, I can, there can be competing truths that both are valid and worth recognizing. But I think the other thing I'd love to just touch upon is this whole idea of nostalgia. There's so I
Mhm.
think I am very, very careful to, I hope that I don't fall prey to it, although it's probably impossible not to. Because it's so unfortunately nostalgia is really it's something that's made up, right? I mean, it is not actually. There was a wonderful lecture I listened to, and it is the president of the Getty, and I unfortunately can't remember her name, but she was talking about memory, nostalgia, and history, right? And part of it was talking about part of the conversation was around what do these big institutions around, particularly in kind of, in the United States or Great Britain,
Mhm.
who have acquired all these different antiquities through, different means. Sometimes they just took them, sometimes they bought them, sometimes, from people who they weren't really theirs to sell. So what do you do with these things now? Do you take them back to the place that they came from? And so in that conversation, it was this idea of history and memory and then nostalgia. And and I think that there is, particularly in the United States right now, and I see it happening in other places, there is this yearning and this longing for a way of life that supposedly happened in the past. Um, uh, a wanting to go back to going to in an innocuous way, going to our neighbor to borrow that cup of sugar and feeling like
Mm.
that's not possible anymore. And I think that nostalgia is dangerous. It's dangerous because it keeps us from being in the present moment, just from a standpoint of kind of mindfulness, right? And staying present to what is really a pretty wonderful world around us, where we are actually healthier than we were in the past. We are doing better by so many measures,
Yeah.
than we used to. So I think nostalgia. I'm always super. I always want to be very careful that I'm not slipping into that. And in history, I mean, we have to be careful with history too, because history is the way that the person who's delivering that information has chosen to take their research and assimilate it and present it. So there's always, and I'm not saying that you have to be, again, we're gonna keep bringing curiosity up, right? We're gonna just say, be willing. And that's why it's so important too, right? To be willing to read things that are not in the newspaper, that is your kind of preferred delivery of news, or to listen to other news networks that may not be, or, engage with people who have distinctly different views than you do. You want to be, it's too easy to silo ourselves and become quite self-satisfied in what we know, and confirmation bias, just continually consuming this information that just reaffirms all these truths that we hold to be self-evident, right? But two competing things can be true at the same time.
Let me tie a couple of things together. And I don't have enough data points, so our conversation has not been long enough to make a judgment call here. So this is just for now a feeling. So tell me what you think about this. But I want to talk about that idea that you just brought forward, that nostalgia is dangerous. And I think you don't mean it in an absolute sense, but let me ask about it anyway. Because nostalgia is a very weird thing, right? And we can even have nostalgia to moments in the past that we have never experienced. Like millennials, for example, like myself, born in the 90s. We can have nostalgia towards the 70s because for some reason we think that, was that the hippie time or was it the 60s?
60s to 70s hippie time, yeah.
Yeah, 60s to 70s, yeah. So we can have nostalgia towards that, going to all those festivals, having a lot of fun with everybody around. We can have nostalgia towards that. Like, if we just went back to the time life would be so much better. We've never experienced that, right? We don't come from that time. So it's a very weird thing. At the same time, okay, I'm a video gamer, so let me give you a video game example. I have a big love for games that I played back when I was very little. Right, on the first PlayStation that came out in the 90s, I can enjoy them highly, even though if you compare them to today's technical standards, they might be very inferior in every single way. Although I think that their stories were a lot better than the ones of today, but that's a separate story. They're great. I can really enjoy them, and that's, I think, driven by nostalgia. Because if I didn't know those games, right, I would never touch them right now because there's stuff out there that's just way better and way superior in almost every single way. So it's this nostalgia is almost, I'm not sure if it's a drug, but it's a yearning towards something that seems better than what we have now. Whether it is, what we talked about earlier, the socializing aspect, right? Being able to go towards your neighbor to get some eggs or get a carton of milk when you need it, something like that. Or going to the bus and to the train and talking with the people that are next to you without them ignoring you or looking at you very weird. Or going back to the 70s, right? To go to all those festivals. It's this mindset of yearning towards something that seems better than what we have now. And now let me ask you a question about that, because I think that if you are stuck in that and you don't look at what the world is today, then I think you're paralyzing yourself. You can't handle the world today. So I think that if you apply the word dangerous there, I still think it's a bit of an extreme word, but I would understand why that word then comes forward. But at the same time, nostalgia might also be able to be a vision, right? Because if there's infinite progression forwards without looking backwards, maybe that takes risks with it. Maybe we are doomed to make the same mistakes that we made in the past. Maybe we steer too far away from what we actually want and desire because once again, the aim that we had in the past is completely lost and bypassed because right now, based on what we know today, we are looking forward. So, to wrap it up and to summarize, can nostalgia not be also a mechanism to calibrate oneself, to use the right information and the right vision to move forward to a future that is most optimal.
Absolutely. I would say I do appreciate your categorization of nostalgia as a drug too, because I do think that there are that's a great description, because there are people who are choosing to reside in this haze of
Hmm.
nostalgia, right? Which is uh, either paralyzing them to rather than to be inspired to move forward, right? And look at our kind of our current resources and the world as it is. And there are definitely things that we can always be. I think it's very important to study history, for example, because we do tend to repeat ourselves, right? We as much as we've had these incredible technological advances, this our main, hub of technology, our brains are still we still have this very reptilian part of our brain, right? That is still processing fear in a way that, is, yeah, okay, maybe I'm not being chased by a large predator that's going to, potentially maim me, kill me, eat me. But, the fear that I feel around, I don't know what it is, changing jobs or something, right? Is still kind
Hmm.
of firing those same places in my brain, right? So I think that that's part of. I mean, we still have this brain that works in some ways the same way it always has. So that's why I think there is this potential for us to repeat mistakes that history, if the study of history could clearly point us in directions that could be more helpful for our current situation. I do think that you could look at the feeling, because the nostalgia is so much tied to an emotion or a feeling, and think about, oh gosh, we just barely talked about loneliness, right? And if we are going to consider this addressing this loneliness epidemic that we seem to be having, um, I don't want to feel so lonely. Okay, so what are the things that you can actually do? Well, I can for starters, I can take out my earbuds when I'm walking down the street so I can actually hear what's going on and choose to say hello to people. So I
Hmm.
mean, there's that piece of where we can take that desired feeling from the nostalgic kind of lens that we have and think about what are those things that we can do right now to bring that forward. And I'm still going to stand by my kind of dramatic choice of words in saying that nostalgia can be downright dangerous, and where I do think it is dangerous. I mean, I think a lot about housing. I mean, I live in outside of Los Angeles. We in California have an incredibly significant number of people who are either, you know, homeless, are, in a kind of temporary state, or are one car repair job or medical emergency away from being out of their homes. And so when I think about kind of reimagining what our cities need to look like, or our suburbs, in the case in California, there's so many suburbs. I think that nostalgia is dangerous if we are only looking at this model of the single family home with its, little perfect lawn in the front and a car, as the ideal.
Hmm.
And I think that it's dangerous in a lot of respects. I think it completely ignores the climate crisis. It ignores the reality of kind of the density, just the sheer number of people who are in need of housing. And so that's where I could see, I mean, that again is another conversation, but that's where I can see nostalgia really um, being dangerous.
Okay, let me try to summarize you just to make sure that I understand you, because in my mind right now, so I'm trying to separate those two. In my mind right now, I hear two things that have a similar meaning: nostalgia and conservatism. So um, if a person is stuck in nostalgia, I think that's something different than not making changes on a policy level to address things that are happening right now. In my mind, nostalgia is the yearning towards something, right? The yearning towards those beautiful video games from the 90s, or the yearning towards those moments where nobody had a mobile phone so everybody could talk to each other. And during our conversation, actually, there were a couple of moments, including where you mentioned that in that article, that you want to go to you want to go on a bus ride or on a train ride, and you want to have interactions with people, which kind of implies in today's society that I think you want to connect with people that are not just focusing on their phones with their AirPods in. So that, to me, in my mind, sounds nostalgic. There's a nostalgic element there. So I think question one is, would it be unreasonable to say that there are some nostalgic elements that you as a person operate on? And then the second question is, um, because to me, it feels like nostalgia by itself doesn't mean you don't make changes on a policy level. It to me, it's this yearning, and it doesn't mean that you are trying to convert that yearning into actual changes, right? Or preventing changes from happening. But it can also be a very beautiful thing. It can be you thinking about, for example, your children when they were very little, and you were like, man, that was a wonderful time, right? Seeing them grow up, seeing them have fun with each other, seeing them interacting with each other. Or maybe a personal memory from your childhood when you were little, maybe a toy or a place that you really enjoyed going to, and just thinking about that and just enjoying that thought of being there, of having that. To me, that is what nostalgia is. Um, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I feel like, I mean, we could have a great second part two one of these days around this. It is, and again, I love words, and I love getting into the nuance of words, right? And I
Mm,
do think there is a there well let me so I think that there's memory, and so the memory piece is kind of, I think, what you're alluding to, of those actual memories of me being with my kids, or that actual memory of that very first time of holding my infant son,
mhm.
and just the power of that memory and the sweetness of it, and just in loving that. There is the nostalgia, I do think, is distinctly different in that it is, and you touched upon this, really hearkening back to a time that you did not directly experience,
Right. Yeah.
right? So, and, but I also think that there can be, I mean, I think I've been divorced twice. And so, I mean, I think about, and when I've talked to other friends who have gone through divorce, there's so much grief that surrounds the dissolution of a marriage. And part of that grief is you are grieving kind of what you had hoped it would be, right? You're not, a lot of times, if you look at just what the day to day was, you're like,
Mhm.
oh gosh, it's pretty clear why we are not a good fit. And so much of that grief, though, is around kind of that there was still hope, or what you had imagined it to be. And I think that that's, again, kind of, maybe that's nostalgia in a current context. But whereas when we're talking kind of more this global yearning for those sweeter, better times, um, nostalgia is distinctly those times that we did not we did, you can have sweet memories about your early video games. And the nostalgia for the 60s and 70s with those wonderful, music, the wild and wonderful music festivals, that I think is nostalgia.
Right. Just to be absolutely clear, and I would generally want to stay away from definitions because it also becomes a definition battle, right? But just to make sure that I absolutely understand you, if I would ask you, could you define your understanding of nostalgia in one sentence? What would that be?
Okay, so in one sentence, boy, anyone who knows me that knows that I'll struggle to do it in one sentence. Nostalgia is would be the that longing and that longing for a time that appears to be better somehow, yet was never directly experienced by the individual experience who has the
Mm,
longing. I think it's much more a concept than
mhm.
having direct. And I think the difference from memory is memory, you were there, nostalgia, you weren't. So that it's a longing for something that
Right.
you never experienced.
Okay, and then I understand where our friction comes from because I will take the first part of your definition, but I will leave the second part aside. So I will say it's a yearning towards either a moment in time, or a place, or a thing, and not the part of has never experienced. So I understand now why you're drawing a distinction between a memory or a or nostalgia. Because I think in your definition you would say that idea of looking back to those video games, or in your case, your children growing up, that would be a memory, and I will define it as nostalgia because it's that love for that specific moment, thing, or
Yeah.
person or place, without necessarily having the idea of going back to that. That's a step that you can then take, of course. If you want to play that game again, then by all means go for it. But it doesn't necessarily mean action, I think. It's just that it's a romanticized idea of something, and just, letting that idea bounce in the mind, closing the eyes, and just, man, those were the good times. You know, but nothing more than that.
I'm going to agree with you. I love your much more succinct and specific definition and of that romanticized idea. Yeah. I mean that is the essence of it,
Hmm.
right? That it is maybe not the truth or the actual history, but a romanticized idea.
And then your comment comes forward because if you are stuck in that, and if you paralyze yourself like that, then that might be considered dangerous, because yeah, there's no way to to deal with the world around you. Although it'll be very hard to imagine somebody who is 100% operating on pure nostalgia and taking all the nostalgia into inaction to change. Although on the other hand, now that I'm saying this out loud, you can also make the argument that that person that we were talking about earlier, that is married to their ideas, they might be nostalgic for their own ideas, maybe, or where those ideas came
Mm.
from, and then refusing to leave those behind. And then that rigidity in the mind comes forward again. So maybe I'm not sure if those two knots can be connected, but in my mind right now, they're clicking together.
I think they're definitely there's definitely a dance happening. It would be
Hmm.
I mean, I think what I love about this conversation in general, right, is just the ways that we can kind of the different layers of our thoughts, right? Tripping and playing with each other, and that we can I feel like I love kind of learning from you and listening to how you're putting these concepts together. And it's so helpful too, right? To be reflected back to and be able to absorb what you're hearing that I've said. So what a gift. I mean, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Just connecting.
The power of summarizing.
Yes. The power is summarizing, but allowing for there still to be little tentacles of details that are out there for the next time.
Yeah. I love that you're saying that. I absolutely love that you're detecting that, because one of okay. So, quick jump to a corporate setting. The reason why you want to summarize people and offer their words back to them, right, in your own words, of course, but the same essence, is because then you tell the other person, I hear what you're saying. I understand what you're saying, right? I'm taking it in. I'm taking my time to really understand you. And creating that, and in this specific case, I'm talking about a negotiation setting, and that's one of my favorite topics in the world, that opens up everything, right? All of a sudden, you have two parties that are completely 100% open to hearing each other's perspective.
Yeah.
And not just throwing that wall up, right? Taking that shield and putting it in front of your eyes again, and not hearing anything anymore, becoming rigid. I think that's one of the most beautiful things in the world. So I absolutely really appreciate that you're detecting that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Well, it's that allows that listening, and that deep active listening allows for that person to remove that little plastic shield of their ideas, right? Or their attachment, right?
Mm-hmm.
To what they think. So, oh, wonderful. Good stuff.
I'm going to make a little bit of a segue here.
Yes.
And like we said, like we talked about in the beginning, this is the beautiful thing about these kind of conversations, right? Because all the prepared questions go out the window. So I'm going to ask you actually the question that I was intending to ask all the way at the beginning of the conversation. But I think this is the right moment for it.
Yeah.
So let's build a little bit on top of that idea of nostalgia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because nostalgia, as we just discussed, is that yearning for, right? It's, which implies that it's an inwards feeling. It's something that is coming from yourself, that is inside of you. So let's tie that idea to spirituality, because I know that in your work, spirituality as a concept is very prevalent. Is very much there. But then the question becomes, what is spirituality to begin with, right? So if I just take a couple of examples here, um, you can ask a couple of different people in a couple of different professions, what is spirituality? And a neuroscientist might, for example, say spirituality is the exploration of consciousness, right? It's the understanding of what consciousness is, how thoughts come forward, and doing brain scans in order to understand, okay, which part of the brain generate which reaction in which situation, something like that. And understanding that is kind of becoming someone who is in touch with themselves, because now you understand yourself. You also have a more nature-based spirituality, being understand, feeling that you are part of the natural world, doing things like outside meditation, hugging a bunch of trees, I don't know,
Yeah.
those kind of things. But then you also have the very mystical form of spirituality. And I think that's also the part where, for example, things like psychedelics come in, where people want to have these out of the world experiences, right? With the use of psychedelics in order to experience something that you and I right now in our, let's say, regular mind will never be able to experience. And the last one, and I think the most famous one, is the classic religious spirituality, right? Which I think the definition to that is one who is aligning themselves towards God, towards that which is the highest. Back to you. In your work, it seems that spirituality is something that you focus on a lot. So let me ask you the question. In your understanding and in your view, what do you think spirituality is?
I really see spirituality as the awareness of, or the perhaps the acceptance of something that which is bigger than yourself. I'm always in my work around spirituality, a lot of times people immediately want to pair spirituality with religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very quick to say that the workshops and the retreats and things that I do that are directly related to considering one's spirituality are non-denominational. That's a big part of it. Uh, for some people, their religion and their understanding of their spirituality is hand in glove, so to speak. There is no distinction. But I think again, just the most kind of core element of spirituality to me is a an acceptance or an awareness around that which is bigger than yourself. And and I am interested in spirituality in the sense that it offers a way for us to understand and get to know ourselves better. When going back to the idea of connection, we we need to be connected to ourselves. We need to have an understanding of who we are. And so some of that journey to finding out who we are is maybe more of a internal, inward facing thing. And I think there also is value and information to be gathered when we consider who we are kind of in a larger context. So there's a duality there that I like to play with.
And what is bigger than ourselves? What is that exactly?
Well, as you mentioned, you were saying that, the kind of, as you listed the different ways that people can think about spirituality, and if you were going to a neuroscientist, it may be about mapping the brain and tapping into the subconscious or unconscious, right? So that's bigger than ourselves because it's the the part of our brain that is not that conscious part that is forming these sentences that are coming out or assigning the name of this chair, an object, a name like a chair or a desk.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be as kind of simple as that, or to, again, as we think about connection and wanting to belong and understanding kind of our place within a larger community, within a larger universe, depending on what your belief system is, a larger body of species, whether if nature is that thing where you find spirituality, right? So there is, I it's a little bit, and I part of the work that I do and the part that I get really interested in is providing a space for people to think about this rather than having any clear kind of assignment of what I think it looks like for each person. But I do think that there is value in getting to know yourself in asking that question.
Okay. So you already kind of answered the question, I think, but let me ask it anyway.
Yeah.
Do you think that spirituality can be cultivated and can exist from a secular perspective?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I do. I mean, I think about, I mean, think, yeah, I mean, and you may not use the name spirituality, but I'll give you a work example. When I
Mm-hmm.
was doing business coaching, I'd have my clients who were usually independent, smaller business owners. So a lot is, riding on their shoulders. They're wearing many different hats. They'd come to me, they'd have a problem, and and going back to that idea of fear, right? And modulating fear between that predatory animal that's ready to eat you and, a business decision, sometimes it was helpful to go through the worst case scenario with a client, right? Okay, so what's going to be the worst case scenario here? And at the end of the day, you're really just trying to figure out, like, is this going to kill me or not? And most of the time, the answer was, this is not going to kill you. Okay. But what I would love to do, and I would often, once I could kind of, reduce that tightness and that closed offness that fear can produce in ourselves, is I would say, hey, like, let's think about the best case scenario, right? Like, why don't we give that a shot? And oftentimes a client, and I mean, even for myself, there would be a struggle. It would be like, well, the best case scenario could be this. And it would be so, it would be so small sometimes, kind of these best case scenarios that were being considered. And the way that I would end up kind of unfolding the conversation with a client was, think about how many times you have worried about a worst case scenario and it didn't happen. And so what was that outcome, right? What was the ultimate outcome of that situation? And I mean, most of the time it was something that they could not have imagined on their own. And maybe that's that which is bigger than ourselves, the spiritual nature of our place in the world and our connectedness to other things.
And what is usually the best case scenario, as you just laid it out, with connecting to spirituality? So if I'm coming to you and I'm interested in what you do, and I approach you from a secular perspective, and I ask you, Kristan, what benefit does it have for me to listen to you and to reconnect with spirituality? What is the answer to that question from a secular perspective?
Oh, sure. And I've had plenty of people who have done my workshop, Discovering Your Spiritual Autobiography, who are coming from either they previously had a religious background that they have completely discarded, or they never had that and they are coming from a secular point of view. And what I would
Mm-hmm.
say is the benefit is number one, not going to be from listening to me. I'm going to provide, again, kind of exercises and do some facilitating. Uh, and what is going to happen in the process of you getting curious about yourself and going through the different questions and prompts is, it can, I mean, at the just the most minimal level, create a sense of gratitude because you may recognize, wow, there were all these best case scenarios that I had such a limited imagination in the moment. And then look at how wonderfully they played out, how my life has played out. So I think that can be this sense of gratitude. There can be also that life affirming piece that happens where you get to say, wow, I've gone through it and I'm still here. And so then I think if there's that acknowledgement and you get to say, whew, I am, I have all these stories and I'm actually more than my stories, right? And I still have stories that are yet to unfold. So maybe that's hope.
What do you mean by that? I am more than my stories.
Mm. I think it is, I love stories. And I think that stories are absolutely a incredible way for us to connect, for us to learn, for us to, just share with each other, and be careful that your story again, does not become a box that you allow yourself to stay in. Because, I mean, if you're still alive, your story is still happening, right? And so, yes, okay, I have plenty of stories. I've been divorced twice. I joke that I'm very happily married to a wonderful person. And, this is my third best and last husband. And that, yes, that is a story. And I have so much more that is still yet to happen. And so I can take the information from my previous marriages, for example, and I can bring that information of how little I knew myself, and how that contributed to not necessarily matching with a person that was probably the best fit for me, to also being afraid of, being conflict averse, right? Um, being nervous about bringing forth subjects that I felt like might be challenging for us as a couple. So those are, I can have stories around those. And what's wonderful is I have these skills, or I have some knowledge that I bring forth into this current relationship that I have, that allows me to much earlier, I say to myself, oh gosh, there's this story of where I totally avoided having this conversation that really would have been much better to have much earlier. How I actively live into that is I bring up something that's on my heart much sooner, right? And I'm willing to kind of trust into, I guess, maybe that best case scenario too, right? It's all kind of swirling together at this moment. But yeah, don't allow or the story could have been, and the story really was at the end of my second marriage, where I was like, oh boy, I am never, ever, ever, ever doing this again, right? I mean, that would be a way of allowing my story to define me, and not have allowed myself instead to be more than my story, and to be open to a world of possibility that's still in front of me.
I've already gotten this feeling a couple of times in our conversation. It sounds like you are a person that rather looks forward and backwards to the adventures that are going to come instead of what has passed. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, I would say that is, I think on the one hand, I have gotten a bit better in being willing to look at the past. I think for many, many years, I was too forward looking, to the detriment of really not allowing myself. I mean, we talked about the grief of the dissolution of a marriage, right? And being so determined not to be absorbed by that. My mother definitely has gone through periods of depression, and I think that as a child growing up and navigating that had a deep imprint on me. And there have been these moments where, if I allowed myself to feel everything that I would feel, it felt so scary. And there was part of me that I wouldn't go there, because what if I never came out? And that terrified me. So instead, my reaction was, oh boy, I'm just going to run forward.
I have a question for you, but this is a question that, if you think it goes too far and if you think it becomes too personal, feel free to not answer. Just let me know, and that's completely fine.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to understand what's at the bottom of this. Because, okay, let me just lay out what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that in general sense, you are not a fan of nostalgia as a concept, or at least being stuck in that. You are also a person that doesn't want to look into the past too much. Studying history is fine to prevent repeating the same mistake, but you don't want to be stuck in a vision from the past, right? Because we have to look at the world right now and we have to move forward. So we have to make choices on what the world is today. And at the same time, you're saying, and you just mentioned that situation with your mother who was dealing with depression, that you rather would move forward instead of allowing yourself to feel or to experience what you were dealing with, because you asked yourself the question. I think it's a legitimate question. What if you never got out of that? Those are a couple of examples, but it gives me the feeling that there is something going on, and it might very well be that thing with your mother that makes you defensive. And maybe defensive is the wrong word, but that makes you be cautious with taking stock and looking into the past and allowing yourself to feel what is going on. And I can take that a step further. And I'm this is inference, so it might be very wrong. So correct me if you think I'm out of line. But it sounds like you're preventing yourself from feeling bad things, or from feeling emotion, or from feeling something that will take you down, let's say. And these are just ideas that are coming forward right now. So let me stop here. Do you think there's merit to this? Do you think this is accurate, or do you think no, you are way off?
Oh gosh, I think that there was certainly a time that as I mentioned, it felt like feeling anything, um, even feeling great happiness was too scary. I mean, either feeling too much sadness, there was a sense of how do I get out of that? And what's the, what's, in a simplistic way, like, what's the value of that? Right. I'm going to feel bad and, you know, there you go. And then there was also that, I mean, it was kind of two sides of the same coin, right? That to get too excited about something or to feel too much joy also felt like, oh gosh, that that's scary too, because then I could let down my defenses, right? And what's going to happen then? So I think that your inference is very accurate. And I will say that at this moment now, where I'm at, I have not only learned to the value of allowing myself to feel the full range of emotions available to me in my life. So the sadnesses and the discomforts, and also just the kind of the joy and happiness that is available to me. And so, that has taken time to figure out how to do that, and to honestly, I guess, just feel safe enough. I think that it really was a survival mechanism, that there wasn't really a sense that there was the distinct sense that being too emotionally, you know, attuned would allow me to be hurt. And so there was a real closed offness that I operated with for many, many, many years. And so, yeah, just recognizing that I'm going to be okay. Again, and that that my story is not all of me. Yeah. But it's hard, and I had to it took me I had to do this incrementally, and it took me a while to learn that I would be okay.
It's tricky. It's really, really tricky. And this is one of the things I really enjoy about this podcast and this conversation with you, because it allows it allows real connection, and it allows really listening and understanding people that come from completely different parts of life, that have completely different experiences. And if you know that you enter that interaction based on good faith, you can have the most amazing conversations. But the problem is, I think at least one of the big problems is that opening up, that idea of allowing yourself to feel, right? That idea of just standing still for a second and taking a breath, right? Just taking some time to take stock and to think about, okay, what is going on right now? Should that be there? What can I do to prevent it from happening again, right? Can I give it a place by understanding it, or by doing something about it, or by reconciliation, or by whatever? That is something that you need positive input for. If there's negative input around you, right? People making fun of you, or people not listening to you, or being very self-absorbed, or I don't even, whatever. Then I think the worst case scenario, it is destructive, right? Because if you're being very heartfelt and somebody is just throwing it back in your face, right? That's destructive. That makes you mistrust the next person more, without that next person even having done anything wrong. But in the least destructive, let's say, and I think still pretty destructive, there's this whole concept of not being heard. And you mentioned the word loneliness a while back, and the word loneliness comes forward in multiple ideas, and we talked about it in the context of dating and having relationships. But I think this is also a very big element of that word, not being heard, right? Not having that connection ever, whether it's a romantic relationship, or whether it's a friend, or whether it's a colleague, or whether it's just a stranger on the street, right? The whole idea of there is a story, yet I am the only one experiencing it, right? There's nobody to share it with. That connection that you were talking about, the entire conversation already, is not there. That's not good. I think that's very hurtful. And I think that if you take it a step further, I think that if you understand, and I think you do very well understand this, if you look at that and you think about what can be done about that, you can make choices that put you back on a track which makes that connection to others it gives you probability of making that connection with others. And I think that's also maybe I shouldn't even put words in your mouth. Let me just ask you point blank the question: what made you want to come on the podcast? Is that something along these lines? Is that because you wanted that connection, or is it more? Yeah, I'm not even going to fill it in. What for you is that reason?
As I mentioned, I appreciated the thoughtful way in which you kind of pre-qualify your guest. I feel like you are already setting the stage for a very open and not anything but superficial conversation, right? So I think that there was that sense of credibility and trust that you and I had brought up. I also, listening to other episodes, there again, that was that I had a confidence in your ability to talk about big topics and to ask questions that would go, might be challenging, and even when you prequal, kind of when you allowed me the out on a recent question, and I so there's so the attraction to this particular podcast in general was you and your style of hosting and interviewing. In terms of my motivation, I would say what ended up making the biggest difference for myself in allowing myself to move out of a person who was not allowing themselves to feel, whether good or bad, feelings and emotions, and who was living who part of the way that I did that is my life was in these very distinct compartments or boxes, right? There wasn't a real commingling within myself. And what I wish I could describe, a moment or a person, but it really has been just this little evolution of moments and people and things that I've felt that have allowed me to understand how important it is to trust ourselves, right? So to start that the ability to cultivate positive connections with others, the place that I had to start was by having a positive connection with myself. And so that needed to be where I started trusting myself. I started listening to myself, and I decided to challenge the input that I was maybe sometimes getting, or kind of the disconnect between information that people who were kind of authority figures or people who were in power of my life, so to speak, were the inputs that they were giving me. So there had to be a real kind of reckoning around the fact that I I have a knowing and I have a wisdom, and I can trust myself. So that had to build. And then once I could listen better to myself, then that allowed for me to be making better choices, and also just have a much more observational eye in my interactions with others.
There's one question that popped into my mind
Yeah.
a, a couple of times while you were talking. I gotta ask you this.
Yeah.
What do you love about life?
Oh gosh, what I love about life is it continues to surprise me in these really beautiful and wonderful ways. So I think that I I don't know that I mean I go to museums, and I mentioned travel, and I mean, so I'll actively do things, but I think the things that I love even more so are just recognizing that the tiny, tiny moments of surprise that are available every day if I choose to open my eyes and am willing to engage.
I think that's a very nice place to end our conversation. Maybe before we go to the end,
Yeah.
because there's a whole bunch that we didn't talk about, a whole bunch, and after for at least two more conversations with. Is there anything that you would like to bring forward that we haven't discussed?
No, I mean, I mean, as you said, we could have multiple conversations. The thing that I will say, and I know that this ventures into the very kind of easy listening, self-help, um, world. But I will say that those tiny, tiny moments of beauty and awe and surprise that I was mentioning that I can find in each day if I'm open to it, I believe that they are available to each one of us. And so I encourage your listeners to find that tiny surprise each day.
Kristan Swan, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. It was wonderful to speak with you. You are a wonderful person.
Thank you.
Especially it's beauty like this that comes forward in conversations, right? These different perspectives that don't always align, right? And they might be black and white, they might be completely opposite. But by having that connection, there is this natural balance happening. There is this natural playfulness happening of ideas mixing up to see, where the truth is. And I think that very much came forward in this conversation. Long story short, thank you very much for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you. And keep up the good work. Stay curious.
Thank you.